Why Black Americans haven't recovered. You should look at how the Native Americans turned out. Then, lots of crime and alcoholism. Low income. Low prospects. It's a goddamn tragedy what those people have endured. Poor people will likely have poor kids and wealthy parents will likely have wealthy kids. The connections, social circles, education opportunities, job prospects of a poor family are different to that of a poor family. Unless the poorer families are given help, then they will likely never reach a higher socio-economical status. Racism and discriminatory laws come in to make the problem deeper, but the reason they exist at all is because Black people, or others, have less economic political power. After the Civil War, Reconstruction era, the radical Republicans were advocates of giving freed slaves 40 acres and a mule each. They knew that as penniless unskilled workers their new political rights would soon be taken away from them without economic power. It never came to pass, and soon Jim Crow laws took hold as was feared. Another good example is of Black immigrants to the U.S. from Africa or the Caribbean. These people tend to be middle class and have connections for them to immigrate in the first place. But once in the U.S. they tend to do much better than the Black population that has been in the U.S. for generations. The reasons are the same as above. Wealthy, well-connected and educated families tend to have wealthy, well-connected and educated children. In short, the poor tend to stay poor. In the U.S. they are disproportionately Black. But without a drastic change or long-term programs they will tend to stay that way. So in your words, they may never recover, regardless of how much time goes by. Are you asking why they haven't recovered since the end of slavery in 1868? Or haven't recovered since the end of redlining in 1968? Something I realized in 2014, 100 years isn't really that long ago. Lots of African Americans have recovered, and strongly. We have tons of individuals who have made tons of money, and seeing someone who is Black and is rich isn't an uncommon thing in certain cities. Lots of people moving into the middle class from lower income, such as myself, through the availability of education and more. The biggest issue IMHO is the culture of the lower class. The amount of praise and glorifying of gangs and more have done a lot of harm to the community. Things are getting better, it just takes a work for people as a whole to do so, and even then some people statistically will still be poor. Trauma cycles in our culture and families of origin. Check out the book Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. The fact is, humans can be so damaged by pain that it changes their brains. Most of adults I have ever known, including myself, behave like children when their value has been diminished. We lash out when what we believe, which usually turns out to be our feelings, are challenged. We can probably fix this, but we will have to figure out what our feelings are, where they came from, and if we want to choose to act from them going forward. Also, we need to stop traumatizing each other and our children immediately. Let's assume you're 30 years old and your generations are evenly spaced apart. So your parents are 60 and your grandparents are 90. Your grandparents were born in 1934. When they are 3, the lynching of Roosevelt Towns and Robert McDaniels would be the first photographs of lynching published in the national press. Lynching public schools would not become desegregated until 1954, when they're 20. So they grew up in segregated schools. Emmett Till would be murdered a year later. This is the environment of their adulthood. The civil rights era was from 19,541,968. So your parents would have been born just after the middle, 1964. So one of their earliest memories would have been MLK's assassination. But it'd also be when the Civil Rights Act was passed. Luckily the worst has passed them by, and as they grow up, The government is working on fixing some things. Redlining was being confronted in their youth, which wouldn't stop them from growing up in those areas. But there's a chance that they'll find it easier to get out. A chance. And that there's a chance their adult lives will be better, is what affects you currently. They were young enough to not be a part of the worst of the civil rights movement. But their parents, your grandparents, did. And that would pass on to them. For example, not a lot of black people know how to swim. Public pools were segregated, so there was no way for your grandparents to learn. And though your parents could, your grandparents might have participated in protests at segregated pools and had acid poured on them. Or read about it, which would add a barrier of hesitation that would prevent your parents from learning. The environment your grandparents lived in would affect how your parents grew up. Which can be literally. But anyway. 1971. The war on drugs starts. And this and other tough on crime policies disproportionately affect black people. This leads to many people in your generation growing up without fathers. The ripples of tough on crime continue into your life, up to adulthood. A 2016 study found that Chicago police performed stop and searches black and Hispanic drivers 4 times more than white drivers. We're skipping over a lot. But now let's look at the present. In this scenario, you're 30, and you're going to have the next kid to keep this generation gap even. The past few years have amplified instances of police violence against black men. How will this affect how you raise your child? How was it growing up with your parents, and how will that affect your kid? Your grandparents were only a couple of years older than you when the Civil Rights Act gave them equal rights. How far away is that really? How is that still affecting you? How will it affect your kid? There is a mental health epidemic plaguing the black community which I don't feel is being addressed. I live in NYC, and the majority of mentally ill, unhoused that I see on the trains and on the streets are black, sad to say. That's what the systemic in systemic oppression means. I disagree with the institutional and structural racism. I'm 1972 black from Philly, and keeping your 3 records clean and hard work pays off. You can turn it around in 1 generation with effort. Fatherlessness. The systemic removal of fathers. That's the real answer. There have been multiple attempts to recover, and they've pretty much all been disappeared. Black Wall Street, Black Panthers, the numerous black communities that have been emptied for highways and man-made lakes. Please look it up, I'd give sources, but I'm very tired. MLK, Malcolm X, etc., etc. Now these events don't account for all of it, but there are a lot of good answers here, and I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents. It takes time to get rid of 400 years of injustices. It's only been 70 years since we were able to drink from the same fountain. That was not long ago. There are tens of thousands of people alive today that experienced those injustices. The American government has only stopped being overtly racist to minorities recently. It's not crazy to say there have been many covert attempts to hurt minorities, especially when you look into the war on drugs that funneled crack into black neighborhoods. Because by the time black people were allowed to even do things like own property, the country was already carved up and given to everyone else. Even things like business ownership have a much higher cost of entry than they used to. So we have literally lost out on hundreds of years of compounding generational wealth. I always immediately doubt the truthfulness of anyone who claims to be a black American, then spouts every stereotypical negative statistic on blacks, and then asks the oversimplistic question, why? Quote, I always suspect that such posters are really white racists who are trolling to spread racist tropes. If you really are a black American, How can you be so profoundly ignorant of your own ethnic and racial history? And why would you seek knowledge on such a complex subject on Reddit of all places? There are plenty of fantastic books to read on this subject, including Stamped from the Beginning, The New Jim Crow, Parting the Waters About the King Years, and, From a White Perspective, the fantastic book Robert E. Lee and Me by Ty Seidule. Read them and then read the criticism of those books and the responses to those criticisms. If you're really interested in the issue and not just a racist troll. If you do so, you'll be able to answer your own question with your own opinions based on historical research, not misleading statistics. I'm in public health and we have a principle called social determinants of health that are useful. It's basically the idea that are your access to education, quality healthcare, quality foods, safe and stable housing, economic stability, etc., will shape your outcomes. You can see this in a child's life and how it impacts their future. Kids who have a rough start have larger hurdles when reaching adulthood. Blaming them for their outcomes is not fair. Even blaming their parents might not be fair. This is why institutional racism exists as an idea. We need to look at the systems that exist to cripple groups as a whole. Native Americans and black families were stripped of their identities, their access to education, wealth, health, etc. for generations for very specific reasons. https health.gov/healthypeople/priority areas/social determinants health. Black Americans were just granted equal rights 60 years ago. Rudy Bridges, the first black child to integrate public schools, is only 69 and has a IG. I think people fail to comprehend that wasn't that long ago and change of culture takes time. Also, the fatherless black household can be contributed to the crack epidemic, which turned into the war on drugs, aka war on black people. Instead of getting addicts help, they criminalized them and mad possessing crack. Diluted cocaine in hard form, worth a crazy amount of jail time compared to powder form, which white people used and could afford. Black communities are over-policed, which leads to high incarnation rates. It's a systemic issue that has to do with policies that overwhelming target black people. It's more complex and more issues, but those are the major drivers. Racism is the reason they prevail. Racism wasn't just slavery. It was so much more hatred, and it continues to this day. Racist policy pushed through in federal and local governments constantly. A police force that overwhelmingly targets black people. Schools underfunded in black neighborhoods. And an attempt to mostly segregate people through neighborhood planning, prices, job offers or the lack thereof. The general type of pricing out of places that are done to non-white people who aren't afforded the opportunity to work jobs that pay enough. Read some books by Thomas Sowell. He can explain it better than I. I don't understand why PPL think the effects of slavery was supposed to just stop. 60% of black Americans live in the South in 2024. That's even with a great migration. It's the legacy of slavery. Take the voting rights stuff aside. A lot of primarily black states are still ran racistly regressive. Take places like Mississippi. Another issue. The government never pulled black PPL up as forkfully as it pushed black Americans down, aka reparations. During the New Deal, while the white middle class was being created. Yes, the US government created the white middle class. You still had black towns being demolished to create the highway system that allowed white suburbs to exist as resident travel back and forth to work. TTYL. Racism never stopped on a systemic level for 90% of the post-slavery time. Culture.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Eracast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.